Boy, g'day guys, it's Sam here from Built Not Bought, and today, you can probably tell, I'm not in my shed, no. And there's a good reason for that. In this episode, we're going to be putting together the old donk for the patrol, and let's face it, my shed's a bit too filthy. So clean. Yeah, that's right boys, so strap in and get ready for Horsepower Alley. Let's absolutely get straight into this one.
Patreon. Support the future of Built Not Bought.
Alright guys, so this is going to be a bit of an interesting one for me on this episode because one thing about motors you need is to be really methodical and patient, and one of those things I do not have. You can probably guess which one. So yeah, there's going to be a bit of help with the old boy, and I'm actually in my old neighbour's shed. So he's got a little engine room in here where he built his drag motor. So he's got some tools, the know-how. So with him and my old boy, we can probably get this thing together with no issues. But initially what I've done, got all the machining done at Engine Machining Services. They've given the block back to me. I've had to give it a wash, clean up with hot soapy water, ready for assembly. Now I'm just going through, there's a whole lot of clearances to check with the crank and make sure the cam fits, and all that stuff's got to be done. And then we can start actually assembling this thing. I've got all the rods and pistons fully balanced as well. If you do want to know a bit more detail of the actual gear that I've used, like the rods, pistons, internals, cam, valve train, all that stuff, there's a video over on my Patreon page. If you don't want to sign up to that and you really want to know because you're building your motor now or something like that, just send me a message and I can send you a link to access that video. But it probably won't be making its way into YouTube because it's more sort of directed into those guys specifically that want that information. So heads behind me were pre-assembled at the shop. They've all been done up with the valve spring supplied by Harrop, and there's some new stainless valves in there. The motor itself, yeah, all cleaned up. Start putting it together. I want to get it in the car this week, so there's a bit of work to do. Just run some time lapses now, because like a lot of this stuff's pretty tedious. I'm not going to run you through the whole thing, but as I talk, I might show you bits here and there that are quite important. But yeah, we'll start by throwing the crank in, cam in, see how it all fits up, and go from there. Alright guys, now we just checked all the clearances on the crank here. What the guys have done, have ground the crank down 10 thou, so I've got 10 thou oversized bearings, but we just wanted to check as well using the feeler gauges there to make sure that that is all true. So we've got, what was it, between 3 and 4 thou between the bearings and the actual crank there, so that's enough for the oil to glide through there. So we'll drop the crank in, torque it up, and we'll be getting close to spinning the thing over and dealing with the pistons.
Until the morning rise, baby, I can't sleep.
Alright guys, now that we've got the crank in there and the bearings all torqued up, what we're going to start looking at is the pistons and rods. Now you can't just go whacking them in, we have to set the ring gaps first. So the way to do that is you want to use, you can actually use the piston to push the ring in to the block there, so it keeps it all squared up. You just use a set of feeler gauges to measure the gap in the ring there. Now, depending on what your application is, whether it's just naturally aspirated or supercharged, will depend on what ring gap you need. Because mine's supercharged, I want a slightly bigger gap than standard. So I've gone through and done all that now. So you do that for the top, the bottom ring. The oil ring generally should not be touched because it's quite a thin ring. You just kind of make sure it's not butting up, and that should be fine there. When the pistons actually go in, you want to make sure that the gaps are evenly spaced around the piston. They are going to move when the engine's running, but just for the initial installation, you want to keep aware of that so all the gaps don't line up in a row, because then your oil's just going to pass straight through. And then with the rods there, I've gone through, cleaned them up, got any swarf and that off from the machine shop, and put in the circlips into the pistons and married up the rods and pistons there, put in the gudgeon pin and put the clip on the back. So there is an upward side and a downward side with the rod and piston. So what I've done is made sure that the piston's facing upwards depending on the inlet and outlet valve, and then the rod actually has a different face on one side to the other because the crank butts them up together. So what you actually have in one space on the crank, there'll be two rods up against each other. So I think I messed it up at the start there, so I had to redo like 3 or 4 pistons, flashback. So I thought I'd just mention this up here. Looking back onto the engine, I didn't realize that the rod and piston actually need to be lined up in a certain way, because this is the top of the piston here, so we've got your inlet and outlet, so the valves need to match up with the head. And when the rods go into the crank, as you know, there'll be 2 butted up against each other. Now these have a bit of a chamfer, and then there's a flat side on here, so the 2 flat sides on the rods need to be butt up like that. And what I've gone and done is put them all on backwards pretty much, so the non-chamfered side is up against each other, and then the flat side is up against the crank, which is wrong. So yeah, it was a good practice run. I got to go redo 3 of these now. So once I got that all sorted, we had all 8 pistons ringed up, gaps set, rods connected, ready to go into the block. The next thing we need to do is start dialing in the cam and crank. So this is a bit of a wizardry thing. I don't know 100% about this. So I got the boys there behind me sorting it out, but basically you can't trust what the manufacturer does with the cam because they don't have your crank. So you just want to verify that the cam and the crank line up with the opening and closing of the valves, etc. So the timing chain that I was given, the bottom gear's actually got, I think, plus or minus 6 degrees. You can actually change on the keyway there. So by dialing it up, you can actually line up, or you can figure out how advanced or retarded your crank and cam alignment is, and then change that bottom gear to adjust for that. So on top dead center, your valves are opening where they should be. So that's what's going on behind me now. Once that's done, we can finally start putting in the rods and pistons and making sure this thing spins up freely, and then work away from there. You see this? You see this here? That's not supposed to be happening. Okay, so I'm going to try and explain this the best I can. We're trying to dial in the cam, and that 50 thou lift, the degrees was way out to what it should be, and it turns out the actual bottom gear on the timing set, there's a crankshaft keyway which shows 0, which is your degree markings, but then there's a second set of markings which show the alignment between the top and bottom gears, and we didn't see that one. So we actually lined up the crank completely out. Probably, was it like 2 teeth out? Yeah. A couple of teeth out with the crank. So now we're gonna like do this all again with these feeler gauges, yada yada yada. So yeah, fun times, take 2. So it's on the flat side of the cam there, the lobe has not come around. You can see it down there. Guess what? -1 degree. That's what you need. So you can see there, it's got -1 degree. And we look at our documentation from Harrop there. At 50 thou, the inlet opens at -1 degree. So that's bang on. We don't even need to change the tooth then. No. Oh. Dialed. Next. Put it together. You can see I said before, we've got the ring gaps there. We want to make sure that the top, or the first and second rings, are about 180 out, and then the oil rings offset from that, probably another 90 degrees. Clamp it up out here. When dealing with any of these machine parts, you always want to make sure you use some soft jaws. Got a bit of aluminium angle line here, just not to damage the sharp edges. Good to go. So now we're talking up the con rods here. You're going to do it in 2 passes. I've got the ARP 2000 bolts on here. So the first pass we're going to do to 40 foot-pound, and then the second pass up to 70 foot-pound. So set up 2 different torque wrenches just to make life easier. Want to be real careful with these bolts, because once they stretch, if you go past that torque setting, you can't reuse the bolt. There we go, that's it. Pistons and rods are in. We spun the motor around a couple of times, made sure it's all cleared, all feeling good. Everything's torqued up, did a double check of that as well. So now it's just putting everything else in. The lifters are going in at the moment. I'm going to start putting all the oil pump and that on the front, put the cover on the back, cover on the front, timing cover, all of that stuff. Work our way up to the heads. The only last thing to do is work out push rod length, which depending on obviously your cam and your lifters, we need to work that out. So I've done the trunnion upgrade obviously on my rockers. So once we set the preload on them, we need to use, there's a special tool, I think it's here somewhere. That's the last thing to do before we put the heads on, get it back home and start working on the top end. Alright, there we go guys, the heads are kind of sitting on there at the moment. The last thing to do is torque these up. So I just want to take a moment to have a look at this thing. Such a long time coming, I'm loving it. I'm pretty sad though that the pistons are gone. I like the look of them too. But you know, you got to put these things together and cover them up. But at least we know what it all looks like inside. It's what's inside that counts, right? Same as doing the bearing caps there, we've got to do a certain sequence as they torqued up. 2 stages, obviously being an aluminium block, aluminium heads, you don't want anything to warp up there, so we'll follow the procedure, do that now, and then come back tomorrow. It's getting a bit late, so we'll come back tomorrow and put all the covers on and then get it back home. I mean, talking bolts as well, there is a bit of a technique to this. You want to keep even pressure, no jerky movement, so it's good to get the elbow high, bit of body weight on there, it should go down. What are you laughing in the background? Why are you laughing? Bit of body weight, elbows high.
Well, you're a gymnast. They make good engine builders. Put bolts in.
Alright guys, what I'm doing now is flip the motor over. I'm going to start putting the sump on now. This is another Mark's 4 drive supply part that I got with my conversion kit. Now the reason you need a different sump is because this is a rear hump. If you got the standard one, it's going to hit your diff and you'll have issues there. But what they've also done with this one as well is sliced a little section off. Now I think Mark's are one of the only companies that actually do this modification, and what it is on full compression of both bump stops, your steering arm can potentially put a hole in the sump here. So it costs a little extra, but it's one of those things to keep peace in mind that you're not going to have any like dramas out in the bush if you do decide to do a jump or something stupid. They give you the windage tray and a modified pickup, so it actually gets the oil down from the lower end of the sump there. So the only thing that you need to do on these is the actual dipstick is normally going through the sump on the LS motor, but with this particular sump it needs to actually go in through the block. Now there's a little Welsh plug that's pushed in there, so ideally you just need to punch that out so you can get the new dipstick in. I'll put the windage tray on here, which will just go on these bolts on the actual bearing caps.
I'm done with your lies. I've got your poison running through my veins. Since I was bitten, nothing ever makes me cold. With your kisses, this fool's been bought and sold. Was it all smoke and mirrors? Was any of it real? Not all is gold that glitters, no matter how hard you want it.
All right guys, and we're back now. We've got the motor back to my place now. We buttoned it up the other day. We buttoned it up.